I am now growing in years, and since I understand that Shakespeare and even Mr. Emmons are deceased, it is not impossible that I may even die. It has occurred to me, therefore, that I may as well retire from the field of letters and repose upon my laurels. But I am ambitious of signalizing my abdication of the literary scepter by some important bequest to posterity, and perhaps I cannot do a better thing than just pen for it an account of my earlier career. My name, indeed, has been so long and so constantly before the public eye that I am not only willing to admit the naturalness of the interest which it has everywhere excited, but ready to satisfy the extreme curiosity which it has inspired. In fact, it is no more than the duty of him who achieves greatness to leave behind him in his ascent such landmarks as may guide others to be great. I propose, therefore, in the present paper, which I had some idea of calling of Memorandas to serve for the literary history of America, to give a detail of those important yet feeble and tottering first steps, by which at length I attained the high road to pinnacle of human renown. Of once very remote ancestors, it is superfluous to say much. My father, Thomas Bob, Esquire, stood for many years at the summit of his profession, which was that of a merchant barber, in the city of Smug. His warehouse was the resort of all the principal people in the place, and especially of the editorial corps, a body which inspires about it with profound veneration and awe. For my own part, I regard them as gods, and drank in with avidity the rich wit and wisdom which continuously flowed from their august mouths during the process of what is styled, quote-unquote, lather. My first moment of positive inspiration must be dated from that ever memorable epoch, when the brilliant conductor of the gadfly, in the intervals of the important process just mentioned, recited aloud before a conclave of our apprentices an inimitable poem in honor of the, quote, only genuine oil of Bob, unquote, so called from the talented inventor, my father, and for which effusion the editor of the Fly was remunerated with a regal liberality by the firm of Thomas Bob and Company, merchant barbers. The genius of the stanzas to the quote-unquote oil of Bob first breathed into me, I say, the divine afflatus. I resolved at once to become a great man, and to commence by becoming a great poet. That very evening I fell upon the knees at the feet of my father. Father, I said, pardon me, but I have a soul above lather. It is my firm intention to cut the shop. I would be an editor. I would be a poet. I would pen stanzas to the oil of Bob. Pardon me and aid me to be great. My dear Thingum, replied my father. I had been christened Thingum after a wealthy relative so surnamed. My dear Thingum, he said, raising me from my knees by the ears. Thingum, my boy, you are a trump, and take after your father in having a soul. You have an immense head, too, and it must hold a great many brains. This I have long seen, and therefore had thoughts of making you a lawyer. The business, however, has grown ungenteel, and that of a politician don't pay. Upon the whole, you judge wisely. The trade of either of editor is best, and if you can be a poet at the same time, as most editors are, by the by, why, you will kill two birds with one stone. To encourage you in the beginning of things, I will allow you a garret, pen, ink, and paper, a rhyming beginning of things. A rhyming dictionary, and a copy of the Gadfly. I suppose you will be scarcely demand any more. I would be an ungrateful villain if I did, I replied with enthusiasm. Your generosity is boundless. I will repay it by making you the father of a genius. Thus ended my conference with the best of men, and immediately upon its termination, I betook myself with zeal to my poetical labors. As upon these, chiefly, I found my hopes of ultimate elevation to the editorial chair. In my first attempts at composition, I found the stanzas to the oil of Bob rather a drawback than otherwise. Their splendor more dazzled than enlightened me. The contemplation of their excellence tended naturally to discourage me by comparison with my own abortions, so that for a long time I labored in vain. At length there came into my head one of those exquisitely original ideas, which now and then will permeate the brain of a man of genius. It was this, or rather, thus it was carried into execution. From the rubbish of an old bookstall in the very remote corner of town, I got together several antique and altogether unknown or forgotten volumes. The bookseller sold them to me for a song. From one of these, which purported to be a translation of Dante's Inferno, I copied with remarkable neatness a long passage about a man named Ugolino, who had a parcel of brats. From another, which contained a good many old plays by some person whose name I forget. I extracted in the same manner and with the same care a great number of lines about angels and ministers saying grace and goblins damned, and more besides that of that sort. From a third, which was the composition of some blind man or some other, either Greek or a Choctaw. I cannot be at pains to remember which exactly. Every trifle exactly. I took about 50 verses beginning with Achilles' wrath and Greece and something else. From a fourth, which I recollect was also the work of a blind man, I selected a page or two all about hail and holy light. And although a blind man has no business to write about light, Still, the verses were sufficiently good in their own way. Having made fair copies of these poems, I signed each one of them Apeldeldoc, a fine sonorous name. And doing each up nicely in a separate envelope, I dispatched one to each of the 4 principal magazines with a request for speedy insertion and prompt pay. The result of this well-conceived plan, however, the success of which would have saved me much trouble in that afterlife, served to convince me that some editors are not to be bamboozled, and gave the coup de grace, as they say in France, to my nascent hopes, as they say in the city of the Transcendentals. The fact is that at each and every one of these magazines in question gave Mr. quote unquote Apeldeldoc a complete using up in the monthly notices to correspondents. The humdrum gave him a dressing after this fashion. Apeldeldoc, whoever he is, has sent us a long tirade concerning a bedlamite, whom he styles Ugolino, who had a great many children that should have been all whipped and sent to bed without their suppers. The whole affair is exceedingly tame, not to say flat. Apeldeldoc, whoever he is entirely devoid of imagination. In our humble opinion, is not only the soul of poesy, but also its very heart. Apeldeldoc, whoever he is, has the audacity to demand of us, for his twaddle, a speedy insertion and prompt pay. We neither insert nor purchase any stuff for the sort. There can be no doubt, however, that he would meet with his ready sale for all the balderdash he can scribble at the office of either the Rowdy Dell, the Lollipop, or the Goose der Umprudel. All this, it must be acknowledged, was very severe upon Apeldeldoc, but the unkindest cut was putting the word poesy in small caps. In those 5 preeminent letters, what a world of bitterness is there not involved. But Apeldeldoc was punished with equal severity in the Rowdy Dow, which spoke thus: "We have received a most singular and insolent communication from a person, whoever he is, signing himself Apeldeldoc, thus desecrating the greatness of the illustrious Roman emperor so named. Accompanying the letter of Apeldeldoc, whoever he is, we find sundry lines of most disgusting and unmeaning rant about angels and ministers of grace. Rant such as no madman short of a Nat Lee or an Apeldeldoc could possibly perpetrate. And for this trash of trash, we are modestly requested to pay promptly. No, sir, no. We paid for nothing of that sort. Apply to the humdrum, the lollipop, or the Goose der Umprudel. These periodicals will undoubtedly accept any literacy offal. You may send them, and as undoubtedly promise to pay for it. This was bitter indeed upon poor Apeldeldoc, but in this instance the weight of the satire falls upon the humdrum, the lollipop, and the Goose der Umprudel, who are pungently styled periodicals. In italics, too, a thing that must have cut them to the heart. Scarcely less savage was the lollipop, which thus discoursed some individual who rejoices in the appellation Apeldeldoc, to what low uses of the name of the illustrious dead too are oftener supplied. Has enclosed us some 50 or 60 verses commencing after this fashion: Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, and etc., and etc., and etc., and etc. Appledeldock, whoever he is respectfully informed that there's not a printer's devil in our office who is not in the daily habit of composing better lines. Those of Appledeldock will not scan. Appledeldock should learn to count. But why should he have conceived the idea that we, of all others, we would disgrace our pages with this ineffable nonsense and is utterly beyond comprehension? Why, the absurd twaddle was scarcely good enough for the humdrum, the rowdy dow, the goose theorem foodle, things that are in the practice of publishing Mother Goose's melodies and as original lyrics. And Appledeldock, whoever he is, has even the assurance to demand pay for this dribble. Does Appledeldock, whoever he is, know? Is he aware that we could not be paid to insert it? As I perused this, I felt myself growing gradually smaller and smaller. And when I came to the point at which the editor sneered at the poem as quote-unquote verses, there was little more than an ounce of me left. As for Appledeldock, I began to experience compassion for the poor fellow, but the goose theorem foodle showed, if possible, less mercy than the lollipop. It was the goose theorem foodle that said, "A wretched taster who signs himself Appledeldock is silly enough to fancy that we will print and pay for a medley of incoherent and ungrammatical bombast, which he has transmitted to us, and which commences with the following most intelligible line: Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven, firstborn. We say most intelligible, Appledeldock, whoever he is, will be kind enough to tell us, perhaps, how hail can mean holy light. We always regarded it as frozen rain. Will he inform us also how frozen rain can be at one and at the same time both holy light, whatever that is, and an offspring? Which latter term, if we understand anything about English, is only employed with propriety in reference to small babies about 6 weeks old. But it is preposterous to descant upon such absurdity, although Appledeldock, whoever he is, has the unparalleled effrontery to suppose that we will not only insert his ignorant rantings, but absolutely pay for them. Now this is fine. It is rich, and we have half a mind to punish this young scribbler for his egoism by really publishing his effusion verbatim et literatum as he has written it. We could inflict no punishment so severe, and we would inflict it, but for the boredom which we should cause our readers in so doing. Let Appledeldock, whoever he is, send any future composition of like character to the humdrum, the lollipop, or the rowdy dow. They will insert it. They insert every month just such stuff. Send it to them. We are not to be insulted with impunity. This made an end to me, and as for the humdrum, the rowdy dow, and the lollipop, I never could comprehend how they survived it. Putting them in the smallest possible minion, that was the rub, thereby insinuating their lowness, their baseness, while we stood looking down upon them in gigantic capitals. Oh, it was too bitter. It was wormwood. It was gall. Had I been either of these periodicals, I would have spared no pains to have the goose theorem poodle prosecuted. It might have been done under the act of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. As for Apodeldoc, whoever he was, I had by this time lost all patience with the fellow, and sympathized with him no longer. He was a fool, beyond doubt, whoever he was, and got not a kick more than he deserved. The result of my experiment with the old books convinced me, in the first place, that honesty is the best policy, and in the second, that if I could not write better than Mr. Dante, and the two blind men, and the rest of the old set, it would at least be a difficult matter to write worse. I took heart, therefore, and determined to prosecute the entirely original, as they say in the covers of the magazines, at whatever cost of study and pains. I again placed before my eyes, as a model, the brilliant stanzas of the Oil of Bob by the editors of the Gadfly, and resolved to reconstruct an ode on the same sublime theme, in rivalry of what had already been done. With my first line, I had no material difficulty. It ran thus: to pen an ode upon the oil of Bob. Having carefully looked out, however, all the legitimate rhymes to Bob, I found it impossible to proceed. In this dilemma, I had recourse to paternal aid, and after some hours of mature thought, my father and myself thus constructed the poem: to pen an ode upon the oil of Bob is all sorts of a job. Signed, Snob. To be sure, this composition was not of no very great length, but I have yet to learn, as they say in the Edinburgh Review, that the mere extent of a literary work has anything to do with its merit. And as for the quarterly cant about sustained effort, it is impossible to see the sense of it. Upon the whole, therefore, I was satisfied with the success of my maiden attempt, and now the only question regarded with the disposal I should make of it. My father suggested that I should send it to the Gadfly, but there were two reasons which operated to prevent me from doing so doing. I dreaded the jealousy of the editor, and I had ascertained that he did not pay for original contributions. I therefore, after due deliberation, consigned the article to the more dignified pages of the Lollipop, and awaited the event in anxiety, but with resignation. In the very next published number, I had the proud satisfaction of seeing my poem printed at length, and in our leading article with the following significant words prefixed in italics and between brackets: we call the attention of our readers to the subjoined admirable stanzas on the oil of Bob. We need say nothing of their sublimity, or of their pathos. It is impossible to peruse of them without tears. Those who have been nauseated with a sad dose on the same august topic from the goose quill of the editor of the Gadfly will do well to compare the two compositions. P.S. We are consumed with anxiety to probe the mystery which envelops the evident pseudonym Snob. May we hope for a personal interview? All this was scarcely more than justice, but it was, I confess, rather more than I expected. I acknowledge this, be it observed, to the everlasting disgrace of my country and of mankind. I lost no time, however, in calling upon the editor of the Lollipop, and had the good fortune to find this gentleman at home. He saluted me with an air of profound respect, slightly blended with a fatherly and patronizing admiration, wrought in him, no doubt, by my appearance of extreme youth and inexperience. Begging me to be seated, he entered at once upon the subject of my poem. but my modesty will ever forbid me to repeat the 1,000 compliments which he lavished upon me. The eulogies of Mr. Crabbe, such was the editor's name, were, however, by no means fulsomely indiscriminate. He analyzed my composition with much freedom and great ability, not hesitating to point out a few trivial defects, a circumstance which elevated him highly in my esteem. The gadfly was, of course, brought upon the tapists, and I hope never to be subjected to a criticism so searching, or to rebukes so withering, as were bestowed by Mr. Crabbe upon that unhappy effusion. I had been accustomed to regard the editor of the Gadfly as something superhuman, but Mr. Crabbe had soon disabused me of that idea. He set the literary as well as the personal character of the fly, so Mr. C. such satirically designated the rival editor in his true light. He, the fly, was very little better than he should be. He had written infamous things. He was a penny-a-liner and a buffoon. He was a villain. He had composed a tragedy which had set the whole country in a guffaw, and a farce which deluged the universe in tears. Besides all this, he had the impudence to pen what he meant for a lampoon upon himself, Mr. Crabbe, and the temerity to style him an ass. Should I at any time wish to express my opinion of Mr. Fly, the pages of the Lollipop, Mr. Crabbe assured me, were at my unlimited disposal. In the meantime, as it was very certain that I would be attacked in the Fly for my attempt at composing a rival poem on the Oil of Bob, he, Mr. Crabbe, would take it upon himself to attend pointedly to my private and personal interests. If I were not made a man of at once, it should not be the fault of himself, Mr. Crabbe. Mr. Crabbe, having now paused in his discourse, the latter portion of which I found impossible to comprehend, I ventured to suggest something about the remuneration which I had been taught to expect from my poem by an announcement on the cover of the Lollipop, declaring that the Lollipop, insisted upon being permitted to pay exorbitant prices for all accepted contributions, frequently expending more money for a brief single poem than the whole annual cost of the humdrum, the rowdy dow, and the Goosterland combined. As I mentioned the word quote-unquote remuneration, Mr. Crabbe first opened his eyes, and then his mouth, to quite a remarkable extent, causing his personal appearance to resemble that of a highly agitated elderly duck in the act of quacking. And in this condition he remained ever and anon, pressing his hands tightly to his forehead, as if in a state of desperate bewilderment, until I had nearly made an end of what I had to say. Upon my conclusion, he sank back into a seat, as if much overcome, letting his arms fall lifelessly by his side, but keeping his mouth still rigorously open, after the fashion of the duck. While I remained in speechless astonishment at behavior so alarming, he suddenly leaped to his feet and made a rush at the bell rope, but such as reaching this, he appeared to have altered his intention, whatever it was, for he dived under his table and immediately reappeared with a cudgel. This he was in the act of uplifting, for what purpose I am at loss to imagine, when all at once there came a benign smile over his features, and he sank placidly back in his chair. "Mr. Bob," he said, for I had sent up my card before sending myself. "Mr. Bob, You are a young man, I presume? Very? I assented, adding that I was not yet concluded my third lustrum. Ah, he replied. Very good. I see how it is. Say no more. Touching this matter of compensation, what you observe is very just. In fact, it is excessively so. But the first contribution, the first I say, it is never the magazine custom to pay for. You comprehend, eh? The truth is, we are usually the recipients in such case. Mr. Krabs smiled blandly as he emphasized the word recipients. For the most part, we are paid for the insertion of a maiden attempt, especially in verse. In the second place, Mr. Bob, the magazine rule is never to disperse what we term in France the argent comptant. I have no doubt, never, you understand. In a quarter or two after publication of the article, in a year or two, we make no objection to giving our note 9 months, provided always that we can so arrange our affairs as to be quite certain of a burst up in 6. I really do hope, Mr. Bob, that you will look upon this explanation as satisfactory. Here Mr. Crab concluded, and all the tears stood in his eyes. Grieved to the soul at having been, however innocently, the cause of pain to so eminent and so sensitive a man, I hastened to apologize and to reassure him by expressing my perfect coincidence with his views, as well as my entire appreciation of the delicacy of his position. Having done all this in a neat speech, I took leave. One fine morning, very shortly afterward, I awoke and found myself famous. The extent of my renown will be best estimated by reference to the editorial opinions of the day. These opinions, it will be seen, were embodied in the critical notices of the number of the lollipop containing my poem, and are perfectly satisfactory, conclusive, and clear, with the exception, perhaps, of the hieroglyphical marks. September 15th. Appended to the critiques. The Owl, a journal of profound sagacity, and well known for the deliberate gravity of its literary decisions. The Owl, I say, spoke as follows. The Lollipop. The October number of this delicious magazine surpasses its predecessors and sets competition at defiance. In the beauty of its typography and paper, in the numbers and excellence of its steel plates, as well as in the literary merit of the contributions, the Lollipop compares with slow-paced rivals as Hyperion with Satyr. The Humdrum, the Rowdy-Dow, and the Goose Theron-Poodle excel, it is true, in braggadocio, but in all points give us the Lollipop. How this celebrated journal can sustain its evidently tremendous expenses is more than we can understand. To be sure, it has a circulation of 100,000, and its subscription list has increased 1/4 during its last month. But on its other hand, the sums it disperses constantly for contributions are inconceivable. It is reported that Mr. Slias received no less than the 37.5 cents for its inimitable paper on pigs. With Mr. Crab as editor, and with such names upon the list of contributors as Snob and Slyus, there can be no such word as fail for the lollipop. Go and subscribe. September 15th. I must say that I was gratified with this high-toned notice from a paper so respectable as the Owl. The placing of my name, that is to say my nom de guerre, is impropriety, priority of station to that of the great Sly Ass, was a compliment as happy as I felt it to be deserved. My attention was next arrested by these paragraphs in the Toad, a print highly distinguished for its uprightness and independence from its entire freedom from sycophancy and subservience to the givers of dinners. The lollipop for October is out in advance of all its contemporaries and infinitely surpasses them, of course, in the splendor of its embellishments as well as the richness of its contents. The humdrum and the rowdy dow and the goose-theron poodle excel, we admit, in braggadocio, but in all other points give us the lollipop. How this celebrated magazine can sustain its evidently tremendous expenses is more than we can understand. To be sure, it has a circulation of 200,000, and its subscription list has increased to 1/3 during its last fortnight. But on the other hand, the sums it disperses monthly for contributions are fearfully great. We learn that Mr. Mumblethumb received no less than 50 cents for his late monotony in a mud puddle. Among the other original contributors to a present number, we notice, besides the eminent editor, Mr. Crab, such men as Snob, Slyus, and Mumblethumb. Apart from the editor, the editorial matter, the most valuable paper, nevertheless, is, we think, a poetical gem from Snob on the oil of Bob, but our readers must not suppose from the title that this incomparable bijou that it bears any similitude to some balderdash on the same subject by a certain contemptible individual whose name is unmentionable to ears polite. The present poem, on the oil of Bob, has excited universal anxiety and curiosity in respect to the owner of the evident pseudonym Snob, a curiosity which, happily, we have it in our power to satisfy. Snob is the nom de plume, Mr. Thingum of this city, a relative of the great Mr. Thingum, after whom he is named, and otherwise connected with the most illustrious families of the state. His father, Thomas Bob Esquire, is an opulent merchant in Smug. September 15th. This generous approbation touched me to the heart, the more especially as it emanated from a source so avowedly, so proverbially pure as the Toad. The word balderdash is applied to the oil of Bob, of the fly. I considered it singularly pungent and inappropriate. The words gem and bijou, however, are used in reference to my composition, struck me as being in some degree feeble. They seemed to me to be deficient in force. They were not sufficiently prononcé, as we have it in France,